All right, why don't we begin? I'm Nate Persley. I'm co-director of the Cyber Policy Center, and we are thrilled that today we will be having a presentation from Sandra González-Bailón. She is associate professor at the Annenberg School of Communication and affiliated faculty at the Warren Center for Network and Data Sciences. Before that, she was a research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I should also add, was also a fellow here at Stanford in the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences not too long ago. So we can claim part of her. And she'll be talking about media choices, niche behavior, and biases in online information. She'll talk for about a half an hour, and please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will integrate them into a few questions after she finishes her presentation. So take it away, Sandra.
Thank you. Let me share the screen. Okay, so thank you, Nate. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to be here. I just wish we could meet in person soon. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that. So today, I want to talk about a series of recent projects that aim to uncover the way in which people consume news across media channels. And in particular, the studies that I want to discuss cast light on how different the media choices we make are and how those choices create asymmetries and biases in online information. And I focus on choices here because I want to steer away from prevalent discourse blaming social media for everything bad that happens. And I want to refocus on the fact that most people are not necessarily making the choices that would allow them to meet the democratic ideal of the informed citizen. And this is not to say that social media are not doing things that are wrong, but I'm refocusing the lens to highlight the fact that we, the people, still have agency and that our choices still reveal our interests and that those interests are not necessarily leading us towards high quality news. Very generally, the research that I will discuss today tries to understand the consequences of having transition from the broadcast era, when the number of news sources were limited and most citizens were exposed to the same information, to the current era of network communication, which is characterized by a long tail of media options and by rising numbers in the supply of news. And as you know, this digital transformation has changed how news are supplied, but also how they are consumed, right? Research tells us that there are long tails on both sides of the equation. On the supply side, there are many sources, but only a handful of those sources attract high levels of attention. The rest create pockets of specialized or niche audiences. And on the demand side, there is a minority of politically interested individuals who drive most of the action we measure on the aggregate when we look at the reach of these news outlets. And these small group of what we could call political junkies create most of the traffic and the attention around news and political information. And as you also know, many accounts have suggested that this increased choice leads to audience fragmentation, ideological segregation, echo chambers with no cross-cutting exposure, and also that the decentralized nature of these communication networks is increasing attempts to manipulate information and seed the networks with false or misleading content. And so the research problem here really boils down to two key pieces. On the one hand, there is the question of exposure, and on the other hand, there is the question of the effects that exposure has on individual and collective behavior. And so if exposure is driven by self-selection, meaning that people choose to read only those sources that they already agree with, the fear is that these will reinforce or exacerbate polarization. If certain types of content are amplified, say by bots or by algorithms, the fear is that these will exacerbate conflict. And if false information prevails in the content that people get exposed to, then the fear is that these can lead to opinion manipulation and harmful behaviors. And this is a possibility that the pandemic has placed at the center of many policy discussions. Now, of course, substantiating all these fears requires evidence. and taking the right measurements at both exposure, at the level of exposure and the level of effects is anything but easy. Most journalistic accounts that we encounter are based on anecdotal evidence, right? On the one case that perfectly illustrates an argument. And so it's up to us researchers to provide the bigger picture of how prevalent these dynamics are. Digital trails have made it much easier to analyze exposure to media content. But of course, those trails and digital data in general are no panacea either, right? And so as we discuss in this piece, which I co-wrote a few months back with a dream team of co-authors, as we argue in this piece, digital data still needs to be distilled into meaningful measures that capture the complexity and the interdependence of human behavior, right? The quality and the significance of our research depends on the quality of our measures. And that means that we need to be constantly thinking about how to improve the measures that we use to build our theories. And our theories of how media and social media shape access to information or misinformation are no exception. And so as we discuss in this article, once upon a time, we used surveys to measure exposure to news. And now we have come to realize that surveys are very limited when it comes to giving us an accurate measure of exposure, and that behavioral patterns can give us more precise estimates of the information that people consume. But of course, behavioral data also has its limitations, and it requires a series of analytical steps to process the raw material, right? The data in raw format to then be able to extract conclusions to inform interventions or future research questions. And this is something that my team and I have tried to do in recent years to try to compare patterns in news consumption that can be kind of come up with measures of patterns of news consumption that can be compared across time and across political contexts. And the two studies that I want to discuss today build on this prior work. And just to give you a brief account of what we did in this prior work, so that I can talk about its limitations and enter into the two papers that I want to discuss. Let me just say this. One of the things we do in this past work is analyze news consumption as networks of co-exposure, where the nodes are news sources and the ties measure the amount of overlap in their audiences. And this approach has allowed us to determine if news dyads are growing increasingly richer over time, or whether there is clustering in the consumption of news along ideological divides. And one of the things that we found in this research is that the answer to these questions really depends on whether the data analyzed includes mobile access, right? The data that includes multi-platform estimates, meaning measures of exposure to news across devices, shows increasing trends in network density and increasing trends in co-exposure. And we would miss these trends if we only analyze desktop-based behavior, which is what the vast majority of the research to date has done. And by the way, one of the papers that I want to discuss today also does. When it comes to data, you win some, you lose some. It depends on which source of data that you're analyzing. But this highlighted that our conclusions are really contingent on the data that we have access to and the measures that we build with that data. Another thing that we found through the combination of web tracking data and social media data is that legitimate news sources still attract more visibility within the confines of social media platforms, and that this is the case across political contexts. In this particular study, we analyzed data from France and Spain, and in one of the studies that I will discuss today, we refocus attention on the US. But so on the basis of this prior work, and again, just to contextualize the two studies that I want to discuss today in the larger ongoing research agenda, on the basis of this prior work, we concluded that there is evidence of selective exposure along ideological lines, but that ideology alone does not explain changes in co-exposure networks, right? People consuming news online are increasingly consuming news from a wider range of sources, and they are not being trapped in echo chambers. But we also find that a large fraction of the online population, bordering the majority, and in some cases just plain majority, they are not consuming any news on the web. And this points to a much more profound form of selective exposure and a growing inequality between those who consume news and those who decide to opt out. And Likewise, even though our social media research shows that traditional outlets are still the main sources of information, automated accounts are still generating a disproportionate amount of the content that people see online. And although we find no evidence that these automated accounts distort the visibility of news sources, they are still seeding social media networks with high volumes of information. And so just to enter into the limitations, this work is obviously also limited in a number of ways. Our work on co-exposure networks, for instance, operates on the aggregate level. So we didn't gain much insight into who is creating those co-exposure ties. And likewise, this was data restricted to web traffic. So we couldn't answer the question of how co-exposure networks or how rich information diets are across media channels. So maybe there is more evidence of polarization or fragmentation within social media platforms compared to the web. And we couldn't really look into the demographic divides that separate what we call the political junkies from the majority of the population who consume very little news or opt out completely. Likewise, in our prior work, didn't look explicitly at our unreliable information. Many of the media outlets that we treated as traditional or legitimate news outlets may also be spreading misinformation at the story level. And we didn't look either at whether there are any ideological asymmetries in the prevalence of news, and existing literature seems to be increasingly pointing in the direction that this is a pattern. And this is where the two studies that I want to discuss in more depth today come in. In these two studies, we again rely on web tracking and social media data, both focused on the US, but they are designed to address some of the questions that we couldn't address in the past. And so the first of these studies analyzes exposure to news for the same subset of individuals across TV, the web, and YouTube. And just to anticipate the main findings, we find that less than 10% of all the panelists view and browse news on the three platforms. And this is a small group of hyper consumers that is formed predominantly by older male users with higher education. And we also find no evidence of substitution effects in the time that these users spend consuming news on each of the three media channels. And so controlling for demographics and random effects, an increase on news time on one platform has a positive impact on news time on the other two platforms. And so this is the study that we use to uncover what we think are important demographic divides in how audiences navigate a high choice media environment with only an unrepresentative minority of users engaging with the news across the media landscape. And this, of course, has implications for how we think about opinion leaders and the role that they play as curators or mediators to information. And as I always say when I give talks like this, there is only so much time and so much detail I can go into. And so if any of you has an interest in reading more about this work, the working paper is online. And I'm always happy to receive feedback in any form, either in the Q&A session or later by email. This is joint work with my brilliant student, Tian Yang, who's, by the way, in the job market. So the data of this research comes, that we analyze in this research comes from the Nielsen TV and web panels. And these two panels span the period of January 2016 to August 2019. The TV panel tracks viewing behavior for both live and recorded national TV on a minute-by-minute basis for about 300,000 unique panelists. Including, and it includes information of the name of the program and the station that is being watched. The web panel tracks desktop web browsing behavior for about 365,000 unique panelists, and it contains information on the URLs visited and the duration of the visit. And then there is an overlap of about 55,000 unique panelists between the TV and the web panels, which means that we can track their exposure to news across both platforms. The analyses that I will discuss in this talk are based on this subset of intersecting panelists. In the paper supplementary information, we include additional results based on the two separate panels. As mentioned, the web panel contains information on the URLs visited, and these allowed us to identify viewing activity within YouTube's domain. And so what we did was to use Platforms API to query those URLs in order to obtain additional information about the videos watched by the panelists, including metadata like the publishing date, the channel, the category, numbers of likes, views, and comments. This is a visual description of the data that we analyzed. As I said, the panel data here tracks co-exposure to news sources within and across media platforms, so that's TV, web, and YouTube, for the same set of unique panelists, about 55,000. We have time-stamped individual level exposure measures to news sources within and across media channels. That's what we try to illustrate in panel A. And then what we show in panel B is essentially that YouTube offers many more choices of news sources than TV or the web, but then it lags substantially behind in terms of reach, which in this case is the number of unique panelists that are visiting these sources. And this is what we show in panel C. The vertical lines mark the means of the distributions. And then what you have in panel D is essentially a measure of inequality in this reach distribution. We show that audiences on TV and the web exhibit similar levels of concentration around a handful of news sources, whereas YouTube is much more decentralized. In this figure, we have additional descriptive information. And what we show here is the relative prevalence of news content in viewing patterns for the TV and the YouTube data. And so clearly news content is much more common in TV news diets. And this is consistent with prior work. And so what we see here is that about 25% of people watching TV watch news programs, but the percentage for YouTube users is about 5%. And so in fact, the denominator here are all the videos or all the programs watched. And about 25% of those are news programs in the case of TV, and about 5% are news videos in the case of YouTube. Okay, so what we do here is to look at the fraction of all panelists that accessed one or more channels for TV and YouTube, or one or more websites in the case of the web, during our observation period. The vertical lines stand for 5 missing months in our data. So as you can see, about 80% of all panelists are exposed to at least one news channel on TV. Less than half of the panelists access at least one news domain. And a substantially smaller fraction of the panelists access new channels on YouTube. Again, that's about less than 5%. But this percentage increases during the observation period, in contrast with the declining trends observed on TV and the web. And the caveat that I want to make here is that, again, these, for the web and the YouTube data, they're both based on desktop browsing, which our own research previously documented is underestimating actual volume, traffic volume. The strength of this data is not that we also have mobile access, but that we can track the same individuals across. But I want to put that on the table because we're probably underestimating the amount of people that are accessing news websites and news YouTube channels. But I wouldn't expect the general trends to vary drastically if we were to include mobile, although that's a pure speculation. So here we look at the actual demographic composition of the users consuming those news, right? The first thing to note in this figure is that only about 5,300 of all the panelists access news, and this is less than 10%, access news sources on the 3 platforms. And what the models suggest is that age is the most important predictor of news exposure. These are mixed effects models, and here we are controlling for variation, temporal variation, and variation at the individual level. So this is nested data at the month level and at the individual panelist level. So controlling for that, what we see here is that age is the most important predictor of news exposure compared to the base category, which is the 18 to 25 group. Older panelists are more likely to consume news on TV and the web, but they are less likely to access news on YouTube. Education is positively correlated with online news consumption, and women are less likely to access news online. They are also clearly less likely to consume news from all 3 platforms, and this is what we show in panel C. However, if we look at time spent on these channels, we find no evidence of substitution effects. What this means is that time spent consuming news on one platform increases time spent consuming news on another platform, except for YouTube, which doesn't have a significant impact on TV news time. And so the coefficients that we show here are estimates controlling for all the other demographic variables and random effects at the month and panelist levels. And so essentially what these results suggest is that online media amplify already high levels of interest in the news, at least for the subset of the population that consume news across the 3 channels. So how do we summarize all these? Well, our findings suggest that online media help achieve this normative ideal of the informed citizen by boosting news consumption. Rather than triggering substitution effects, we find that online media amplify time spent consuming news. But this amplification effect only benefits those who are already interested in the news. And this is a very small fraction of the population, less than 10%. And so what this is revealing really are important demographic divides, right? Women in particular are clearly less likely to use online sources to consume news, even after controlling for education. The existence of gender gaps in the consumption of news was documented years ago using survey data. And so the fact that these divides remain visible more than 20 years later and in a high choice media environment is suggestive of the constraints that many individuals still face to meet the demands of the democratic ideal. More generally, as I anticipated, our results help us characterize the digital equivalent of the opinion leaders, right? Which is a figure that was first proposed to understand the effects of mass media. And so the opinion leaders were theorized to be the small group of individuals that consume media content and then pass it on through their networks of interpersonal contacts, triggering potentially a chain of social influence in opinion formation. In this digital age, those networks are largely mediated by internet technologies like social media. And so these hyper consumers that we identify in our analyses create the elite of opinion leaders that are then likely to propagate their own curated news through their networks. And the fact that this small group of opinion leaders is far from representing the population at large unveils one of the ways in which the information circulating online may perpetuate important biases in the salience of some topics over others. And I think this is one of the areas that future research should aim to investigate in more depth, right? The impact that hyper consumers have on information bias and other types of information inequities propagating online. Okay, and so with this idea of information bias hanging in the air, I want to move on to the second project. And here we look into the prevalence of unreliable information on social media during protest mobilizations. And this is something that we didn't fully address in our previous work. And in particular, we try to determine if there are ideological asymmetries in the sharing of news covering those mobilizations. And again, just to anticipate the main findings, we show that there is no evidence of unreliable sources having any prominent visibility during the protest period, but we do identify asymmetries in the ideological slant of the sources that were being shared, with a clear bias towards right-leaning domains. And this supports what we call the conservative advantage thesis, which points to the structural conditions that allow better message production from the right. And again, you can find all the details in the paper. This is joint work with Valeria D'Andrea and Manlio De Domenico from the Foundation Bruno Kessler in Italy, and Dean Freeland, who I think gave a talk also a few weeks back, who's at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. And the context for this project are the protests that followed the death of George Floyd in June of 2020. These protests, as you all know, became one of the largest protests in US history, and it also consolidated the Black Lives Matter movement as a global movement. In line with the research that we did in the past with protest data from France and Spain, in this paper, we also want to test some intuitions about how the Twitter stream amplified news coverage of these mobilizations. So this figure gives us a first glimpse of our data. The upper row shows the number and the location of protests organized in the contiguous United States, according to Crowd Counting, which is a consortium of researchers that compile data on political protests through news stories as well as individual reports. And then the lower part of the figure shows the count and the location of the tweets in our data set. And so overall, Twitter activity reflects a similar temporal and spatial distribution to offline protest events, with June 6th being the day of greatest activity. Most of the tweets, in line with, again, with what we showed in prior work, are generated by human accounts. That's about 58% of all accounts. But unverified bots, about 42%, generate a very large fraction of the total volume. And verified media accounts, which are less than 1%, generate a very small fraction of all the messages. So here, what we show in panel A is a breakdown of all the URLs that were shared on Twitter during this protest period. Most of the URLs go to news and information domains. And if you look at the inset, within this category, local news prevail. In panel B, we show the ideological scores of these domains, which we obtain using a metric that has been used in past work. It's called the favorability score, which essentially it's based on the ideological positioning of the audiences consuming these news sources. And we obtain this data from ComScore. The closer to one domain is, the more of its audience self-identifies as Republican, and vice versa. The closer a domain gets to -1, the more liberals are consuming that domain. Panel C looks at the association between the audience reach of these domains on the web, which is again a metric that we obtain from ComScore, which maintains panels of web activity for a representative sample of the population. The panel is not representative, but it is weighted to be representative. And so what we find in panel C is the association between the audience reach of these domains on the web. So that's the fraction of the US online population accessing the domains during this period, and the number of tweets that contain URLs to those domains. A note here that only a few labels are shown to improve legibility. And so domains in blue have audiences that lean Democrat, and domains in red have audiences that lean Republican. And in panel D, we show the results of our regression model that incorporates all this information. This is a linear model predicting domain visibility, measured as total URLs shared and unique URLs shared with 99% confidence intervals. And so essentially what we show here is that audience reach on the web is the most important predictor of visibility on Twitter. And URLs pointing to news and information sources are also more salient than non-news URLs. And controlling for these two variables, we find that Republican-leaning URLs appear in more tweets, but controlling for these, controlling for partisanship, conservative-leaning URLs appear in less. And I'll say a little bit more about this later. If we break down the ideology distributions by domain subcategories, so local news, general news, and political news, we see that the right-leaning slant is particularly clear for political or partisan domains. And this is a category in which we have domains like thehill.com, the Getaway Pundit, Mother Jones, or Western Journal. And if we change the unit of analysis from URLs to users, so the Twitter users posting these URLs, we find first that posting URLs increases the number of retweets that those users get. And second, that posting Republican-leaning URLs also has a positive impact on the number of shares that those posts receive. And again, we see that controlling for partisanship, posts with conservative-leaning URLs receive less shares. And what this means is that what we call the advantage of the right, the conservative advantage, the advantage of the right has a limit, right? The most extreme outlets and the conservative distribution do not attain the same level of visibility as the more moderate right-leaning outlets. In panel C, we show the retweet network collapse to the approximately 280 communities, which we identified with a random walk algorithm. And so essentially each community represents a group of accounts that retweet each other more frequently than accounts in other communities. And what we encode with the color of the nodes is the reliability score assigned to each community based on the URLs that they share. And so just to tell you a little bit more about these, the reliability scores are provided by NewsGuard, which is a journalism and technology company that rates the credibility of news and information websites. Each site receives a trust score on a scale that goes from 0 to 100 based on 9 criteria. 5 of these are related to credibility, and 4 of these criteria are related to transparency. So essentially, websites that receive a score of 60 points or higher receive a green rating. What this means is that the website is following basic standards of credibility and transparency, and below 60 points, websites receive a red rating, which means that the website fails to meet basic standards of credibility and transparency. These ratings are provided at the news domain level, right? They're not provided at the news story level, so that's a limitation. And essentially what this figure tells us is that most domains shared on Twitter during the protests are classified by NewsGuard as reliable. They have a reliability score of 60 or higher, and there is no association between the reliability scores and the ideological scores. And again, if we could deaggregate these reliability scores to the story level, we probably would find different patterns here. These reliability scores are applied to the entire news domain, not to specific stories. And so back to this figure, the color in panel C and D encodes that reliability score that we assign to each community based on the URLs, on the domain of the URLs shared within that community. And so panel D shows the same communities as they fall in the 2-dimensional space defined by the ideological scores. The red dashed lines are just the medians of the distributions. And so essentially what this figure tells us is that most communities share URLs to reliable content, even those on the extremes of the ideological distributions. Communities with users sharing less reliable sources are very small, but when they exist, they are in the right-leaning quadrants of the ideology distributions. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm speeding up. How do we summarize all this? Well, in this paper, we address the question of who produces news coverage and how audiences respond to that content in the same social media stream that is used to organize the protests. And so from the supply side, we find that most of the news posted on social media as the massive street protests unfolded are produced by media with a right-leaning ideological slant. From the consumer side, we also find that right-leaning news content generates more retweet activity, and so it increases the reach of those stories. And so our work shows that on one of the most prominent political issues of the 21st century, the perspective of right-leaning outlets dominated on Twitter, which is a surprising finding if we consider that the well-documented population advantage of liberals over conservatives on the platform. However, our findings are also consistent with studies of the right-wing media ecosystem, which has developed an alternative to mainstream media and regularly attracts mass attention on controversial issues. And we are trying to emulate some of these findings on other social media platforms, but I can't say much about that right now. So let me just wrap up and put everything back together and go back to the question, what are we learning about the current media landscape? Well, we are learning that one of the big difficulties we confront today is not only that the media landscape has become way more decentralized than it used to be, it is also that information is flowing through all these parallel channels, the web, social media, TV, radio. And not only are we far from measuring in accurate and reliable ways exposure in each of those channels, but we are even farther from understanding spillover effects, right? I always say that only about 20 to 25% of the online population is on Twitter, but journalists are overwhelmingly on Twitter. And whatever happens on Twitter percolates to what we watch on TV and what we read in our traditional newspapers. And likewise, as we show in the papers that I discussed, a lot of the content produced by mainstream media percolates through Twitter. And so I think we're still far from understanding those dynamics. The other big problem is not so much what digital technologies do to our news or information exposure, but how they allow us to opt out. And this is the choice that a large fraction of the online population seems to be making when it comes to high quality news. And so one of the priorities for future research, to my mind, is to look at this huge chunk of the online population that do not seem that interested in news and ask, so where are they getting their information, right? And are they more vulnerable to misinformation campaigns? And this is a question of meeting people where they are and not where we would like them to be, say, coming to consuming news from the New York Times, right? And so the bottom line is there is still a lot of work to do. And as we think about how to do that work, I think we should go back to the discussion about measurement and opportunities and challenges we face in this digital age. And so the two most important challenges that we have to think about, and we discussed these challenges in detail in the paper that I already mentioned at the beginning of my talk, have to do with platform control of data access and ethics, right? Increasingly, the data that we need to make informed decisions about how to curate online content or how to regulate the role of platforms or how to encourage us to engage in our best behavior, right? All these, the data that we need to make informed decisions about all these lies in the hands of the platforms themselves. And even though there are a few initiatives that are intended to strengthen collaboration between those platforms and academic and independent researchers, those initiatives are not enough to answer all the questions that we, the research community, have. And I wouldn't say that there's a lot of agreement either on what the most important research questions are, right? So that's on us. Related to data access is the question of ethics and how ethical considerations might lead to restrictions in data access, right? A lot of the data that we have analyzed in my group are aggregated. We cannot deaggregate the data at the to the individual level. And one of the reasons is because that's a way of protecting privacy. And so we lose granularity, and that restricts the number of questions that we can answer. And so there's anonymization techniques that add noise to the data and also make the data less granular and potentially less useful. And so these are not easy to solve questions, and the answers we provide to these questions will delimit the research space in which we operate in the next decade. And so this is definitely one of the most important things that we working on this space should be thinking about. And I think I'm going to stop here and open this up for discussion. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen and we can start talking.
Great. Well, thank you so much. There's a lot in there. Actually, well, I don't know whether I need to go to this slide, but I have a few like informational questions, some that were actually in that were brought in. But let me start with the characterization of the right and left leaning content, because I found as I looked at those sources that I understand the method at how you get at this, because you want to be objective. You don't want to say, all right, we think Fox News is conservative, MSNBC is liberal. But if the New Republic, Bloomberg, and Reuters are part of the right-wing ecosystem, and Business Insider and BuzzFeed are the left-leaning ecosystem, I'm starting to wonder what you're getting at here. And I didn't, was Breitbart on there? I don't know if I saw Breitbart on there. But so Breitbart's correctly tagged as right-leaning, yeah. And I was also interested in like how big a force they were on the right. But do you see that? Are you at all concerned about some of that leakage there? Because most people wouldn't think that those are our right-leaning sources.
So attaching those labels to the sources is always, yeah. So in our case, we follow the audience-based approach, which is agnostic to the actual content of those news sources, and it relies exclusively on the self-positioning of the audiences accessing those domains. In the case of our data, we obtained that particular information from Comscore, and Comscore maintains panels. And then for a subset of their gigantic panels, they ask questions to their panelists. And two of the questions they ask is, where do you place yourself in the conservative liberal scale? Where do you place yourself in the liberal conservative scale? And so on the basis of that, we can then look at the composition of the audiences of these news sources. And so it's very important, and I think we try to be careful when we talk about these labels, that this is based on it's right-leaning, left-leaning, in the sense that these sources seem to be favored by people who think of themselves as being on the right or on the left. And of course, it's also a matter of magnitude, right? But you are totally correct that, I mean, if we were to use a different approach based on analyzing editorials or then I'm not sure we would find a more agreeable consensus.
And I don't think, I mean, look, as you know, there are a lot of Stanford scholars who popularized this method, particularly as deal with, like, say, campaign finance and other, the method, you guys are honest about what the method is. I'm just wondering whether it affects whether it would affect any of the conclusions about the right. I mean, your conclusion seems totally right to me, right? Which is that, and consistent with what we know about the structure of the right-wing ecosystem. And so I was wondering how lumpy that ecosystem was, whether what you're, because when I saw Reuters in there, I'm starting to think like, look, if Reuters was dominating the right-wing ecosystem, and I think that's that's cause for celebration, right? And so, but my guess is it's something else that you're finding there. Is that it's the typical sort of story about concentrated, sources and really kind of close networked activity between a few of these right-wing institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what we should also, I think it's totally correct. I mean, one of the ways in which this measure may be noisy is that, of course, it is more accurate for news domains for which you have more panelists visiting those domains, right? You attribute an ideological score to a domain on the basis of people accessing that domain. And that means that we have more information about the domains that have a higher reach, and these tend to be closer to the zero score, right? So equal number of the Democrats and Republicans go to those domains. We also have more information about those. And we have noisier measures for the domains that are at the tails of the distribution, which is not to say that our scores in this particular case, they seem to be consistent, like Breitbart is on the right. I mean, it has a higher score. I mean, there's some face validity to this number. Sort of more general problem that in a way we try to emphasize with the first study is that a lot of these long tail dynamics require capturing behavioral trace data for subpopulations that are not likely to be in our panels, right?
Right.
And it's on the extremes that we fail the most, right? And so that's a problem.
Well, but that's part of the story you're trying to tell, right? I mean, is that there aren't. So web news consumers are a small share of the population to begin with, right? And then among those, the ones who are in the right wing, who are subject to the right wing ecosystem, is going to be a much smaller share. So you're talking about 10%. You're talking about 10% of the population to start, right? And then how many? And then let's say 1/3 of that is captured in the sort of right wing network you're talking about.
The 10% applies only to people who are consuming news on TV, the web, and YouTube, right? So this in that part of our analysis, we don't factor in ideology. One way to address what you're saying would be to look at the actual reach of these extreme outlets, and even though they have significantly lower reach than the main kind of the CNNs and the Fox News, I think that we're still underestimating how many people get attracted to those domains, just because those people don't tend to participate in the panels that we use to analyze, even though we have gigantic panels. And so I think there's a lot of blind spots that we can illuminate with large panels, but not necessarily solve. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to think what you think the real, so all we've got is your paper right now. So let's focus on those findings, but just sort of what you think the real story is here. What is because I think the argument seems sound to me, right? Which is that between both these papers, which is that you have a small subsection of people who are seeking out news, and then the news environment is warped in certain ways based on the characteristics of the ideological, biases in the media ecosystem or something like that, right? I mean, that seems consistent with other findings. But consistent with what you were just saying, I would think, and a lot of the questions that are coming in the chat are asking something like this: how much of what people are consuming as news is from news sources, right? There's another. This has been at Annenberg School. There's been a long tradition of sort of questioning whether news sources are the ones where people are getting news. This even goes back to what the studies that Kathleen Hall Jamieson did on The Daily Show and some of these other things. So how much do you think what you're capturing is? Maybe that's just a separate question, but how much do you think what you're capturing is actual news? You're getting most of news consumption online.
So yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, we had to confront that question when we were comparing TV activity, web activity, and YouTube activity, because our starting point was the web data and a census-like list of domains that have been considered by prior work, including our own, as newsworthy, right? And so it's kind of like a cumulative approach where we literally just merged together all the lists of open access, like papers that have been published that publish the list of domains that they consider as newsworthy. And then we just merged that together and literally just matched, right? Like, so we just went looking for them. On TV, we could do that, but we actually ended up following the classification that Nielsen provides on TV news programs. And again, that's easy to check, right? Like, so you can go at the program level and see if it's classified as news or not.
Right.
And we could challenge that label. On YouTube, we just use, we started by matching our list of news domains on YouTube channels, but we ended up using the platform's label of news content, which is provided by the user himself or herself when they upload a video, right? So it's like a bottom-up labeling of content. And so when we ran our queries through the API, one of the things we obtained was information on video classification. And so we ended up choosing that to select. So just on that basis, we have three very different definitions of what's newsworthy, right? And I think it's a great question, and especially, if we had, we didn't take a kind of machine learning approach to classifying content as newsworthy or not. But the colleagues who do that, I mean, again, what counts as civic content or as newsworthy content, that I would include in that category memes that are just visual. And I think that's at the very cutting edge. I don't think we have an agreement as to what is the best way of classifying content that's circulating online. And I think the big challenge now is visual content and videos that are not so easy to, we're getting there, but it's not so easy to parse that kind of content. We still rely on textual information. And so there's a lot of space for improvement in that area.
One of the other questions we got in the chat was about whether the social media platforms are included as websites in the web, category, right? And so, because that would make sense, right? If people are getting a lot of news through Facebook, not that they're clicking through onto another site, but that they're getting their news off of Facebook. Are you picking that up?
No, because Facebook is a black box for the purposes of these studies, right? Like, so. With web tracking data, if someone clicks on a link that's posted in their feed on Facebook and they go on the web outside of Facebook and they open a browser and they actually go, that is captured by their web tracking data. But if you just read the news headline and whatever caption on your feed, but you never go outside, that's not on the data. And so, of course, when I showed in the slide the different layers of media channels, we consider TV, web, and YouTube and Twitter in a separate study. We're saying nothing about Facebook because it requires data access that it's not part of any of these studies, right? And so all that it's a walled garden. All that activity is entrapped in a epistemological black hole. We don't know. What we know about that requires those collaborations, or trusting what these researchers do. Like after several months after we finished the conservative advantage paper, Twitter researchers published an article on how algorithms seem to be amplifying right-leaning content. And they use a completely different definition of right-leaning content. In their case, they use media bias check, like other sort of not an audience-based approach to right-leaning content, but they also found that their own algorithms, and they don't know why exactly, I think they are following up on that, but the algorithm seems to amplify right-leaning content. And so that's consistent with what we show. In our case, we care about that bias, acknowledging all the limitations that you mentioned, Nate. Those are problems, how we classify, what are we getting into here with our labels? But we were partly surprised because, very surprised, because again, this is a stream of Twitter information related to covering the protest mobilizations around the Black Lives Matter movement. And you wouldn't expect right-leaning domains to be the most prevalent sources. And of course, there was a lot of action on the streets, and a lot of these links point to videos that were shown on TV. I mean, but it seems like this is a contested space where, there's a lot of literature suggesting that social media has allowed counterpublics to emerge. This casts a shadow on those claims in the sense that those counterpublics are not necessarily being successful at conveying their message if these mainstream news outlets are still the most visible in telling the story, right? Where you put your camera covering a mobilization will tell a very different story. Depending on where you put your camera, you will tell a very different story about street protests, right? So that was a surprising finding.
And I think that's very useful. This goes back to the question of when you started talking about the democratic ideal here. I sort of want you to flesh out what the argument is you're arguing against, because it seems to me that this paper is effective in highlighting something some of the folks in the Internet Observatory have published on this as well. Just looking at that we've moved away from thinking about the average user, right, and what most people are confronting, to thinking about these pockets of whether it's extremists or just hyper consumers and all that, and hyper producers and the like. And so to show that I mean, you find that, right? Now let's I'll put on my sort of law professor's hat a little bit here, just thinking more normatively about this, since this is a cyber policy center. How does that dovetail with your conception of what you think the democratic ideal suggests? Because it sounds like actually, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Start with what you think the argument about the democratic ideal suggests, and then what you think the data sort of how it undercuts it.
Well, I think there's a normative, sort of all this research is based on this normative conception of democracies understood in an epistemological way, right? Like, so you are a good citizen if you stay informed of what those representing you do so that you can hold them accountable, right? Like, there's other versions of how we could imagine our democracies based on action, not on knowledge. And I'm echoing here a lot of my students as well. And I'm not saying, so there is a presumption that in order to be a good citizen, you need to be informed. And I think all of us agree with that expectation. And so it is a problem if we don't know who our representatives are or what they do, right? And in order for us to get that knowledge, we have to stay informed. And news offer the mechanism for us to be able to exercise that mechanism of accountability. Now, but it is a normative model of democracies based on knowledge and not based on other things like, other forms of engagement. And so in terms of regulation, I mean, so
well,
I guess
I would start a little bit, because I want to make sure I understand the way your findings, what they say about whether we are far off or close to that ideal.
Right. When you give a choice, so the choice that the vast majority of the population seems to be making is they prefer to opt out of news consumption when there's other types of content around, entertainment, games, you name it. And that's a choice. Like in many, that's a choice that people make. We live in a high choice information environment, and the choice we make, it points in one direction, right? For the vast majority of the people. I used to have a version of my presentation slides in past presentations that ended with the newsreel idea, as asking a kind of a provocative question of, should we go back to that? Like every time you go to the movies, you are forced to sit in front of the newsreel so that everyone has the basic common ground. And, there was a lot of propaganda going on there as well. It wasn't necessarily information that was being, and so I'm not sure what to do with these findings and other than put agency back in the scheme of things, right? Because we talk a lot these days about how social media are ruining our democracies and how algorithms are amplifying the most extreme voices. And all this is true, but also compatible with the fact that we may not be making the best choices ourselves when it comes, we don't always make the best choices when it comes to our diets or when it comes to deciding whether we smoke or not. And in the health realm, we may not be making our best choices either. And when it comes to meeting our responsibilities as citizens, and I include myself here. I don't want to adopt the position of, and so that's a pattern that emerges over and over. It's not necessarily new, right? Like Michael Carpini, my colleague at Annenberg, wrote a long time ago a book about what do Americans know, and sometimes they don't know a lot about things that are important for their lives, politically speaking, and so. What do we do with these findings? I'm not sure, but what it's certain is that if we intend to regulate how social media companies operate, I think taking into account behavioral patterns of how people choose what to do with their time online is also relevant, right? And then, of course, if algorithms are amplifying our worst natures, then that's important to know as well. But the choices that we make are important and it feels sometimes that we don't think too much about those when we talk about these issues. And so that's what I guess the research that I presented today emphasizes mostly, that when we have choices, we choose things that are not necessarily the best according to our normative expectations.
And I think that, this is something for those who are watching, both the Virality Project and the Election Integrity Partnership that we've done here at Stanford with a whole group of folks, right, are consistent with that. It's about that most people, even the problematic content, most people are opting into it as opposed to being forced over to it, right? And, but tell me a little bit about the relationship of the second paper to this idea of this democratic idea, because what you're showing again is something about the unique structure of the right-wing media ecosystem online, right? And so what is that? Why should I be concerned about that? Is I guess the way. What is it that is inconsistent with? Is it because this is just leading people toward lies and extremism, and it's just another story about polarization, or is it something deeper about? Because if people are choosing that, what is that? What does that say?
So I think there's two answers here. One is from the supply side and one is from the demand side. And then I'm going to give some conclusions about what this means in the context of the movement in particular, because, more generally, I think it's more complicated. But so on the one hand, there's the fact that if there's a structural advantage to right-leaning outlets to be able to produce more content, that's good to know. And that's one part of the answer. The other is if people, the audiences, favor certain types of content more than others on certain platforms, that's also good to know. And then we have to unpack, because Twitter is algorithmically driven as well. And again, on the basis of this research that has been published recently, part of this may be, the amplification of certain sources, part of it is organic, but part of it is algorithmically driven. And if that's the case, that's good to know as well, right? But I think it's very dangerous to enter in the territory of, and you're here probably an expert more than, are you going to regulate the kind of the sources that people elect? Again, are we going to go back to the newsreel era? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. And so within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and how we think about counterpublics and how we think about how these decentralized networks of communication allow movements to come together and organize without central organizations, I think the implications of these findings is that that this is a contested space, right? Like if the point is to put some ideas on the spotlight, then there's other counter forces that are going to try to counteract those efforts. And the hashtag activism on its own is not going to be that useful if the big outlets are gaining prominence, right? And so. But how do you think about things, Nate? I
think so. It sounds to me like the story that you want is particular. I like the fact that you take the Black Lives Matter protests as the focus here, because it seems to me, we should be open about this. There is a problem if right-leaning publications have a larger megaphone when it comes to characterizing the Black Lives Matter protests, right? Because that is, you're literally talking about a movement for equality and trying to deal with police brutality. And yet, if one part of the media ecosystem is amplifying a particular message, then we would be concerned. Now, again, it's going to be for a concentrated public, right? And so we don't know how big a deal that is for the overall debate, right? Mm. But that seems to be why I think that's a really good example. Well, I see I'm getting the hook from our various administrators here. I want to thank you so much for presenting this great findings. People ask where they might be able to see some of these papers. I assume they can go to your website.
Yeah, they are linked. Yeah, absolutely. They are all linked.
Your website. Well, also your Twitter feed is at González-Bailón. If people want to look at that, is there any other? And what's your website URL?
Yeah, my website is on the Twitter profile, but it's sandragonzalezbailon.net, I think, or the Annenberg website. We'll link to that as well, or they can email me. The papers are reachable in multiple ways. So
and Haifa has been kind enough to she put it in the chat. So thank you so much. And you are this was a wonderful way for us to end the fall term for our Cyber Policy Center seminars. And we will be starting up again on, I believe, January 11th is our next one. And so I welcome people to come back. And thanks so much for such great food for thought. And thank you to everybody who participated in the chat. We will see you next year.
Okay, bye.